A very good afternoon to you. Look, Trump has begun signing orders. How has that been received? In particular, his move to try and undo Obama's climate change agreements with the rest of the world. And we know that the UN already said that whether he changes this or not, it won't affect the actual deal.
Well, he's playing to his base, Alicia. Essentially, Donald Trump is stepping up to the plate, if you will, now as President of the United States, trying to fulfill as many campaign promises as he can, certainly through executive action. Of course, it takes much longer to get congressional and senatorial approval so that his intentions perhaps could become law. So what we will see today, as we have seen since he took office on Friday last week, are a number of executive orders. That trend will continue this week. He will go to the Department of Homeland Security today, where we are told he will sign an executive order in terms of redirecting federal dollars, is what they're calling it, redirecting federal dollars towards the building of that southern border wall with Mexico. Of course, this was a big campaign strategy. In fact, it was one of the first things he spoke about when he announced his candidacy in June of 2015. And this is now a fruition of that policy. Earlier this month, he spoke about how he will seek congressional approval for the spending towards that wall. Of course, during the campaign, he has reiterated a number of times that Mexico would be responsible for paying for that wall, something the Mexicans, of course, as you know, Alicia, have refused to do. But Donald Trump now talking about congressional approval for paying for that wall and then getting Mexico to reimburse the United States.
Sherwin, I mean, let's get a sense of what he can do and undo. I mean, I know you've mentioned that it's going to go back to Congress and in order for it to be approved, but let's understand the processes to actually undo on such important agreements.
Well, I guess the question is, what authority does the president and his executive orders have, right? What is an executive order? An executive order, in layman's terms, is essentially an instrument of legal veracity that the president has under his authority as the executive branch of the United States government. And so it does have legal standing. But for example, let's use a practical example. One of the executive orders he's already signed was to basically reduce the regulations that are incumbent on companies in terms of implementing the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And many people erroneously now believed that through that executive action, Donald Trump has repealed the Obamacare legislation, which he does not have the authority to do. The only way you can repeal legislation in the United States is through action within the legislature and approval through the Senate and then signed into law by the president. He has not done that. He has issued an executive order. He has perhaps changed the rules and regulations, but an executive order cannot overrule standing legislation in terms of the United States Constitution.
A very quick one, Sherwin. Now, we know that later today he will be signing even more executive orders. Do tell us more about those.
Yeah, great question. A number of facets here, Alicia, so let me go through it very carefully. He is expected to sign an executive order that will at least temporarily ban for up to 4 months most refugees entering the United States. You'll remember that under the Obama administration, the number of refugees admitted into the country annually was increased to around 110,000. 10,000 of those refugees were to be from Syria. What the Trump administration is seeking to do through executive order is to reduce that overall figure from 110,000 down to around 50,000. In addition to that, an executive order will block for 1 month visas, I beg your pardon, to anyone from countries deemed to be exporting terrorism. So Syria, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia and Sudan. So Middle Eastern countries, African countries, but countries that have Muslim majorities. These will now be, visa restrictions will be quite severe on countries like that. And in addition to that, following on that campaign promise to build a wall, a version that he called for during his campaign for a temporary ban on Muslims entering the country. So you'll remember that there was this call during his campaign to ban all Muslims from entering the country. And so what we're seeing now is perhaps a milder version of that. But interestingly enough, 4 of the 6 countries that I've named have either U.S. military on the ground or in the air. Syria, Somalia, Iraq, Libya, some sort of military action from the United States exists in those countries. So it's very, very interesting to see this institution of a ban on visas for people wanting to enter the United States from those countries.
Yes, Sherwin, before I let you go, does that mean, are we likely then to see more sanctions against some of those countries that you have mentioned, particularly where there's military bases in those countries?
Well, this is kind of a punitive sanction in a sense, Alicia. I mean, you can call it a sanction, you can call it a punitive measure in terms of banning people from entering your country from certain countries. But what I can affirmatively say is what we will definitely see are more protests on the streets of the United States. There are emergency calls for protests in New York later today. Given some of these executive actions that we are seeing a very aggressive stance from the Trump campaign in trying to dismantle the legacy of President Barack Obama. And so you will see some reaction, as we did in Washington, in those historic numbers. Over 1 million people taken to the streets in the nation's capital one day after the inauguration. You will see pockets of that spread out across the United States as these executive orders are signed later this week.
All right, thank you so much for that sound update. That is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our U.S. correspondent, and he is live to us from New York in the United States, and he was giving us an update on the imminent changes to certain orders by new U.S. President Donald Trump in his administration. Let's take a quick